the lead is amateur world champion Pip Baker.
Do you ever wonder what it was really like growing up in the summer of the 1970s? Growing up then meant long days of freedom, neighborhood adventures, and simple joys. But looking back now, why does it all feel so far away? You have not truly known summer until you have felt the shock of cold water bursting from a sprinkler onto your bare feet. This was not just about staying cool. It was the neighborhood version of a luxury pool party. If your idea of a party involved crabgrass, a stubborn garden hose, and 10 kids yelling like they were being chased by bees, parents called it free babysitting. You just had to plant the sprinkler in the middle of the lawn, crank the spigot, and suddenly every kid within shouting distance was lined up to take a turn. Most of the time, it was just one of those classic rotating sprinklers, the kind that swished left and right like a tiny metal fan. But to us, it may as well have been a water park. We would run in circles, jump through streams, and pretend to dodge invisible lasers. There was no such thing as being too soaked. The wetter you got, the better you played. And once you were done, you sat on the porch wrapped in a threadbare towel, eating an ice pop, watching the puddles dry on the sidewalk while your hair still dripped onto your knees. No one cared about mud or mess. It was about being free, being loud, and feeling like you owned every last drop of summer. We never questioned it. It was just what you did. And somehow, it was always perfect. Somehow, the freezer in every 1970s kitchen was always crammed full of mismatched Tupperware, frost-covered meat, and at least a dozen homemade popsicles waiting to stain your lips red, blue, or green. No molds? No problem. Ice cube trays with toothpicks or old yogurt containers worked just fine. The main ingredient was always Kool-Aid. Sugar was not just added. It was dumped in by the cupful. The brighter the color, the better the flavor. And if your tongue was not dyed for the next 6 hours, you probably got the weak batch. Kids back then wore their popsicle pride on their faces. Purple lips, neon mustaches, and sticky fingers that left trails of evidence on every doorknob and couch cushion. It was a badge of honor. No one cared about processed sugar or natural fruit juice. This was joy in its cheapest, most glorious form. Some popsicles had a mysterious crunch to them, like maybe someone forgot to stir. Others were more syrup than ice, but they all tasted like pure summer. They were the reward after mowing the lawn, the prize for surviving a road trip, or just something to cool you down after an hour of playing tag in a heat wave. We would sit on curbs, legs stretched out, popsicle juice dripping down our wrists, watching the world go by one sticky slurp at a time. It was magic, it was mess, and it made those long, blazing days just a little sweeter. If you grew up in the 1970s, your bike was more than a bike. It was your ticket to freedom. No helmets, no GPS, and definitely no adults. Just you, your banana seat, and the open road, or at least the cracked pavement of your subdivision. Those seats were long and curved like a smile, usually covered in sparkly vinyl that burned the backs of your thighs if it had been sitting in the sun too long. We would slap playing cards in the spokes to make that glorious flapping sound, our homemade motorcycles. Some kids had tall handlebars, others had streamers. Someone always had a flag waving from the back wheel. You met up without planning it. You just rode until you found the pack, like a slow-moving, half-organized gang of sunburnt rebels. The whole neighborhood was your racetrack. You cut through yards, zipped past mailboxes, and braked too hard just to hear the screech. Sometimes you had a destination, the corner store, the park, the weird kid's house with the trampoline. But usually, the ride was the point. You kept going until your legs gave out or someone's chain popped. Then you would flip the bike upside down, spin the pedals, and fix it yourself. No adult ever taught you that. You just knew. That was the thing about summer back then. You learned everything on the move. You did not need a watch in the summer. You had the streetlights. That was the universal sign that the day was over. The rule was simple. When those lights blinked on, it was time to head home. No arguments. Until then, the entire world was yours. You could roam as far as your feet or your bike would take you. Parents were not texting every 5 minutes. There was no such thing as a check-in. You were just out. playing tag in someone's front yard, jumping over sprinklers, laying on the sidewalk, daring each other to touch the hot pavement. The light turning on was always a bit of a shock. It was like a bell ringing at the end of recess. You would blink, realize how dark the sky had gotten, and shout to your friends that it was time to go. Sometimes you tried to stretch the rules, just a few more minutes, just one more game. But once that light came on, your feet knew the way home. You would walk slow, dragging your fingers along fences, still laughing about something stupid someone said hours ago. And when you got home, you smelled like grass, sweat, and maybe a hint of bug spray. You ate dinner late, your skin still warm from the sun, your hair stuck to your neck. Nothing was ever scheduled. It just was. You never heard it coming. That is what made it magic. The faint jingle would sneak up from a few blocks away, distant at first, like the start of a dream. Then it got louder, closer, until it was everywhere. And you knew. The ice cream truck was here. You ran. It did not matter what you were doing. You dropped everything, a book, a toy, your dignity, and sprinted to find the nearest adult who might have some change. Quarters clinked in your pocket as you made your way to the curb, joining a dozen other kids, all jittery with excitement. The truck was not fancy. Usually it was a faded white van with faded cartoon decals and one tiny window. But to us, it was a miracle on wheels. Bomb pops, drumsticks, push-up pops, choco tacos, and maybe, if you were lucky, one of those weird bubblegum eyes that never really tasted like gum. You ordered fast, paid in sweaty coins, and unwrapped your treat like it was sacred. It melted faster than you could eat it, but no one cared. The jingle played again as the truck drove off, the sound fading back into the heat. And just like that, the moment was gone. But for a minute, it felt like the whole summer stopped just for you. If you had a slip and slide in the 1970s, you were a backyard legend. This was not some high-end pool toy. It was a strip of thin plastic you unrolled on the grass, soaked with a garden hose, and then hurled yourself down like your life depended on it. Usually, it tore within the first week, but it did not matter. That first ride, the way your chest slapped the plastic, the cold water spraying your face, the grass and dirt flying past, was everything. Some kids ran full speed, others took a running dive. It did not always end well. Bruises, belly flops, and the occasional face full of mud were all part of the deal. When that got old, you switched to a hose war. No rules, no teams, just grab whatever you had. Buckets, super soakers if someone's parents were rich, or just the hose with your thumb pressed over the end to make a spray. Shirts clung to your skin. The grass turned to mud. Everyone was soaked, screaming, and slipping all over the yard. And when it was over, you sat there, breathless and dripping, your knees scraped and your heart full. It was a water park built from nothing but plastic, pressure, and the desperate need to cool off. And we loved every single second of it. Before smartphones, before social media, before any of us even cared what SPF meant, there were swimming holes. Or, if you were lucky, the community pool. These places were loud, chaotic, and smelled like chlorine, wet cement, and the occasional hot dog. And they were perfect. You would ride your bike in wet trunks, a rolled-up towel slung over your shoulder like a badge of honor. Pools back then were packed. Kids cannonballed off diving boards that looked 100 feet tall, even if they were only 10. The shallow end was for handstands and Marco Polo. The deep end was for bragging rights. If you could touch the bottom and come back up with both goggles still on, you were a legend. But nothing beat a swimming hole. Cold, murky, and probably full of leeches. But it was free, and no one could tell you what to do. There were no lifeguards, just older kids pretending to be in charge. You climbed slippery rocks, held your breath too long, and came home with mosquito bites in places you forgot existed. Everyone smelled like sunscreen and sun-warmed towels. Parents sat off to the side with paperbacks and iced tea, barely watching but always nearby. It was all rough around the edges, and that made it better. As soon as the sun dipped low and the sky turned that deep hazy purple, they came out. Fireflies, like tiny stars drifting just above the grass, blinking slow, hypnotic signals that said, "Summer is not over yet." And for us, that meant one thing: catching them. You grabbed a jar, poked holes in the lid. Sometimes you used a net, but usually just your bare hands, clapping gently around the air and praying you did not squish one. If you caught 2 or 3, you were already feeling lucky. 5 or 6, you were the king of the backyard. We would sit on the porch, jars glowing faintly at our feet, talking about nothing, watching the little lights blink on and off. It felt like you had bottled magic. There was no prize, no point, just the quiet thrill of doing something that felt impossible and pulling it off anyway. Other times we hunted caterpillars, dug up worms, or chased dragonflies through the tall weeds behind the fence. Bugs were not gross. They were fascinating. And every jar felt like a science experiment you could show off at breakfast. You never kept them long. By morning, the lids came off, and the bugs flew or crawled away, because we knew even then that some things were better when they were free. You did not need a console or a controller to play the best games of the 1970s. You just needed a rusty coffee can, a patch of yard, and a bunch of kids who refused to go inside. Kick the Can was part hide-and-seek, part tag, part full-on chaos. You would pick one unlucky soul to guard the can. Everyone else would scatter like ants. If the guard saw you, they called your name and tried to tag you. But if someone else kicked the can while they were distracted, boom, everyone was free. The yelling, the running, the bruises, that was all part of it. Ghost in the Graveyard took it to another level. You played after dark, in backyards and driveways, one kid hiding while the rest hunted them down. The twist? The ghost jumps out at the last second, and everyone runs like their life depends on it. It was terrifying, in the best way. You screamed, you laughed, you tripped over garden hoses. And when it was done, you laid in the grass, staring up at the stars, breathless and buzzing. No batteries, no screens, just adrenaline and friendship. It always started with scrap wood, some crooked nails, and an idea too big to explain. The backyard was your canvas, and that tree, that was your skyscraper. Building a treehouse in the 1970s was a rite of passage. You borrowed tools from your dad's shed, a hammer too big, nails too long, and a measuring tape you barely knew how to use. There were no blueprints, just visions of ladders, trapdoors, and windows made from old milk crates. Every friend pitched in. Someone always knew where to find a busted sheet of plywood. Someone else brought the snacks. You climbed, balanced, hammered, and hoped nothing collapsed. Eventually, you had it. Your own secret fort high above the grass. Or if the tree said no, you built it on the ground. Behind the garage, under the deck, anywhere you could stack boards and call it yours. Inside, it smelled like dirt, sweat, and mystery. You kept comic books, snacks, maybe a slingshot. A sign out front warned intruders, "No adults allowed." And you meant it. These were the headquarters for every summer adventure. The places where friendships grew, secrets were shared, and long afternoons slipped by without a care in the world. It was not about the structure. It was about the freedom to build something that was yours. The drive-in was not just a movie. It was an event. You piled into the family station wagon with blankets, lawn chairs, and a bag of popcorn that had zero business being that greasy. The screen was massive. The audio came through a scratchy radio dial, and no one cared that you could barely hear the dialogue over the kids 2 rows over screaming about candy. That was part of the charm. You watched the movie through a windshield streaked with bug guts and condensation, but it felt magical. If you were lucky, you got a spot up front. If you were not, you just parked on a hill and hoped for the best. It was the one night where staying up past bedtime was not just allowed, it was expected. Everyone brought snacks from home. Soggy sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, thermoses of lukewarm lemonade, and licorice ropes that were passed between siblings like contraband. It was not about the movie. Half the time, you barely paid attention. It was about being outside, under the stars, surrounded by flickering light and muffled laughter. You might not remember the plot, but you remember the feeling. Cool air, scratchy blankets, and the quiet hum of a summer night. There was a time when the radio was not just background noise. It was the heartbeat of summer. You turned the dial until you found your favorite station, and once that static cleared, it was like flipping a switch to happiness. The Beach Boys, Elton John, Donna Summer, voices that somehow made the heat feel lighter and the sky seem wider. AM radio had a sound to it, tinny, a little fuzzy, but honest. The kind of sound that felt alive, like it was being broadcast straight from someone's garage. We would sit on porches with boomboxes or drive around with the windows rolled all the way down, letting the music spill out into the streets. It made every errand feel like a road trip. You did not pick the songs, they picked you. When your favorite track came on, you shouted. Everyone did. You knew the words by heart, even if you never owned the record. Sometimes the signal cut out in the middle of a chorus, and you would slap the side of the radio like that helped. But when it worked, it worked. The music wrapped around everything. Cookouts, bike rides, slow walks home. The soundtrack to 1,000 forgotten memories, waiting to be remembered again. If you had a pair of metal strap-on skates in the 1970s, you were unstoppable. Or at least you thought you were, right up until you hit a rock and flew face first into someone's bushes. These were not fancy skates. They clicked onto your sneakers with a key, the wheels squeaked like a hamster wheel, and the whole setup rattled like it was built to break. But it did not matter. You tightened them up, stood tall, and pushed off like you were on a disco stage. The sidewalks became runways, the driveways were loops. We would race our friends, practice spins we never quite landed, and try to skate backwards like the cool teenagers at the roller rink, only to fall on our butts 5 seconds later. The scrapes were badges of honor. A skinned knee meant you were trying. You kept a bandage in your sock just in case. Rolling over a sidewalk crack felt like driving over a canyon, but that was part of the thrill. You chased the breeze, you felt the rush, and even when your wheels stuck or your laces came undone, you kept going, because falling was temporary. But flying, even for just a moment, was everything. You did not need a forest to camp, just a backyard, a tent, or maybe a blanket thrown over a clothesline, and a flashlight with half-dead batteries. That was your wilderness. You would drag out sleeping bags, coolers full of soda, and enough snacks to feed an army. Marshmallows, crackers, potato chips, and someone always brought a half-melted chocolate bar. Once the sun went down, the real fun began. Every snap of a twig became a monster. Every gust of wind was a ghost. You told the same ghost stories every year, and they still gave you chills. Flashlights were not just for seeing. They were for under-the-chin faces, light shows on the tent ceiling, and secret notes passed from one side to the other. You talked for hours, about school, about crushes, about nothing, until someone fell asleep, mid-sentence, still holding a pretzel. Sometimes you snuck inside by midnight. Sometimes you stayed out and woke up covered in dew, eyes blinking in the morning sun. It was not about roughing it. It was about pretending, about testing your bravery while still being a few feet from the kitchen. And honestly, that kind of camping was better than any real trip. Nothing screamed summer louder than the 4th of July in the 1970s. The parade kicked things off, slow and loud, with fire trucks blaring their horns and kids waving flags like they were born for it. You stood on the curb with sticky hands and squinted eyes, cheering for every float, even the ones you did not understand. Marching bands in too hot uniforms, Shriners in little cars, local queens tossing candy from flatbeds. It was chaos and color, and it filled the air with pride and sugar. But the real magic happened when the sun went down. Sparklers. You lit one, watched it hiss to life, and waved it through the dark like you were casting spells. Sometimes you wrote your name in the air before it fizzled out. Parents stood nearby, pretending not to worry, telling you not to touch the hot end even though you already had. The smell of gunpowder and barbecue filled the yard. And when the real fireworks started, you laid on blankets in the grass, necks craned, oohing and awing at every burst. It was noisy. It was beautiful. It was everything we thought being American felt like. There was a rhythm to a summer afternoon that nothing else could touch. After the chaos of morning games and melting popsicles, you settled into the quiet part of the day. A hammock strung between two trees, a folding lawn chair with cracked plastic straps, maybe even just a towel laid out under the shade. You closed your eyes and listened. Cicadas buzzing, the occasional bark of a dog, the low hum of a lawnmower down the block. If you were lucky, a breeze came through and rustled the leaves like nature's lullaby. Parents read paperbacks. Kids flopped down and traced shapes in the clouds. Someone always fell asleep, mouth open, arms draped like spaghetti over the chair. These were not deep sleeps. They were dozes. Moments when the world got a little blurry and soft. No alarms, no screens. Just the weight of your own eyelids. And when you woke up, the sun had shifted, the ice in your lemonade had melted, and you felt like time had passed without needing your permission. That kind of nap, the summer kind, was its own kind of vacation. If you wanted to say you cared in the 1970s, you did not send a text. You tied it around someone's wrist. Friendship bracelets were the language of summer. You sat cross-legged on the porch or the grass, knotting strands of embroidery floss in patterns you barely understood but swore had meaning. Every color meant something. Red for love, blue for loyalty, green for, well, whatever you wanted it to mean. You gave them to your best friends, your cousins, the kid you met at summer camp and swore you would never forget. And when they tied one on your wrist, that meant it was official. You were bonded. Some kids had entire collections up their arms, faded, frayed, and perfect. Trading charms was the same deal. You had little plastic treasures clipped to keychains and backpacks, mini soda bottles, glitter hearts, tiny animals. You traded doubles. You negotiated. You gave one away just because someone had a bad day. It was small, silly, and sacred. These were the things that told stories when no one else was listening. The kind of gifts that cost nothing but meant everything. Saturday morning had one rule: do not wake the grown-ups. So you tiptoed to the living room, bowl of cereal in hand, and parked yourself in front of the television before the sun had even cleared the windows. Pajamas on, eyes barely open, and then magic. A full lineup of cartoons that only played on this one sacred morning. The Super Friends, Scooby-Doo, the Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner show, they were not just shows, they were rituals. You laughed, you gasped, and you poured a second bowl of cereal without even blinking. The commercials were half the fun, toy ads that promised adventures, breakfast foods loaded with sugar. Sometimes you flipped between channels just to chase your favorite characters. But mostly, you just sat there, letting the sounds and colors wash over you. It felt like the whole world had paused just for kids. No school, no chores, no noise. Just you, the couch, and an endless parade of cartoons. Eventually, someone would shuffle in, bleary-eyed and asking about breakfast. But until then, you were in your own perfect universe. Some kids collected coins, others went for stamps. But in the 1970s, one of the hottest currencies of summer was the humble pop bottle cap. You found them everywhere, under vending machines, in gravel driveways, stuck in the dirt behind gas stations. Each cap had a brand, a color, sometimes even a prize printed underneath. You carried them in your pockets, lined them up on the porch, and argued over which ones were rare. Trading was an art. You knew who had extras. You knew who was holding out. You would swap a bright orange knee-high for a Coca-Cola cap with the red still intact, no chips. Some kids played games with them, flipping them, stacking them, making up rules as they went. Others just liked the way they clinked together in a tin. It felt like treasure, even though it was just trash with logos. But that was the point. You made something out of nothing. You gave value to what adults tossed away, and somehow that made it all the more important. The lights showed up before the tents did. One day the field was empty. The next, it was alive with music, laughter, and the faint smell of fried dough. Carnivals were pure adrenaline. You paid in crumpled bills and got back paper tickets so thin they nearly blew away. The rides were wobbly, the prizes were rigged, and the funnel cake was always just slightly burnt. But none of that mattered. You spun on the tilt-a-whirl until you could not walk straight. You climbed the funhouse steps, screamed in the mirror maze, and dared each other to ride the zipper. The Ferris wheel was for quieter moments. You climbed up, looked down at the world, and felt like you were floating. Your fingers sticky, your cheeks sore from smiling, your pockets empty. And still, you wanted one more ride. The fair always smelled like popcorn, hay, gasoline, and dreams. It was never about the rides. It was about the feeling, the noise, the way time melted in the heat and glitter. When the lights blinked off at night and you walked home with tired legs and a stuffed animal clutched tight, you knew that was summer. Family road trips in the 1970s were not glamorous. They were an exercise in patience, motion sickness, and figuring it all out with a paper map that folded like an origami puzzle from some alternate dimension. The glove box was always stuffed with outdated maps from states you had never even been to, but somehow those crinkled guides became the holy grail of navigation. You stopped at gas stations not just for gas, but for free maps, soda, and those little souvenir license plates with your name on them, if you were lucky. Parents fought quietly over directions in the front seat while the kids in the back used sweaty legs to divide invisible borders. You played I Spy, counted Volkswagens, and argued over who got the window seat. Air conditioning was a maybe. Seat belts were a suggestion. You ate sandwiches from a cooler packed that morning and drank lukewarm root beer that always tasted like the inside of the thermos. But every hour brought something new. Roadside attractions, sunburnt picnic stops, and endless stretches of highway with nothing but power lines and wildflowers to keep you company. You got lost sometimes. But that was half the fun. And when you finally arrived, wherever that was, it felt like you had crossed an entire country. Because in some ways, you had. Skateboarding in the 1970s was raw. No pads, no helmets, no tutorials, just a wooden board with metal wheels and a full tank of childhood delusion. You took your first ride down a sloped driveway and thought you were invincible. Gravity disagreed. Every kid had at least one good wipeout story. Skinned elbows, bruised shins, and chipped teeth were badges of honor. You practiced on sidewalks that were more cracked than concrete and used your sneakers as brakes when things got scary. Most of the time, it worked. Other times, you ended up face first in a bush. But that was all part of it. You learned how to balance, how to fall, and how to keep getting up even when your board shot out from under you like a rocket. Tricks were not polished. They were invented on the fly. You flipped, jumped, and sometimes just rode in tight little circles for hours because it felt like flying. And when you finally nailed something, even if it was just staying upright all the way down the block, you shouted or laughed or threw your hands in the air like a champion. No one filmed it. No one posted it. But you remembered it. That feeling of speed, fear, and freedom all mixed into one. The library in the summer was a different kind of magic. It was cool when the rest of the world felt like it was melting, and it smelled like paper, dust, and secrets. You walked in barefoot or in flip-flops, dragging sand from the sidewalk, and made a beeline to your favorite shelf. It was quiet, sure, but not boring. Every aisle was an adventure. Choose your own adventure books, mystery novels with cracked spines, dog-eared paperbacks full of dragons and time travel. You joined the summer reading club because it came with stickers, bookmarks, and sometimes even free pizza coupons if you finished your list. But secretly, you did it because you loved the stories. You kept a log of every title, drew little stars beside the best ones, and tried to beat your own record. The librarians knew your name. They gave you extra time when the book was too good to finish in 1 week. You stayed until your parents called your name from the doorway. And even then, you asked for 5 more minutes. Books were not homework. They were escape routes. They were time machines. They were everything your neighborhood was not. And best of all, they were yours. All for free. Before online shopping and algorithm-picked ads, there was the Sears Catalog, a paper brick that showed up in the mailbox and flipped your entire summer upside down. It was thick, heavy, and sacred. You sprawled out on the living room carpet, circling items with a pen you were not really allowed to use, planning your entire back-to-school identity 1 page at a time. New jeans, a lunchbox with a cartoon hero on it, Maybe a fresh pair of sneakers that did not squeak when you walked. You flipped through it slowly, page by page, dreaming big while knowing full well you might only get one thing, if that. But circling it made it real. You and your siblings made deals. If I get this, you can have that. You folded corners, wrote your name next to your choices, and built an imaginary closet way better than the real one. Sometimes your parents looked through it too, quietly taking notes. Other times it vanished before you could say anything, and that was the end of that. But for a few weeks, that catalog made you feel like anything was possible. Like maybe this would be the year you finally had the cool outfit on the first day, even if it came from page 294. There are certain smells that do not just hit your nose, they hit your memory. Freshly cut grass in the 1970s was one of those. Every Saturday morning, the neighborhood would erupt with the buzz of push mowers and the occasional clunky riding one, spewing puffs of smoke and the unmistakable scent of gasoline mixed with soil. It was summer's cologne. It stuck to your clothes, your skin, and the air itself. You would ride your bike past a yard someone had just mowed, and the scent would follow you like a ghost. Parents in tube socks and tank tops pushed heavy mowers up and down uneven lawns while kids trailed behind, barefoot and curious, trying to rake patterns in the grass clippings. You knew it was almost lunchtime when that smell hit its peak. It meant someone was working, someone was sweating, and someone was probably about to turn on the sprinkler for the rest of us. Even if you did not mow it yourself, that smell belonged to everyone. It was green. It was gritty. And it meant another Saturday had arrived, full of nothing and everything all at once. The Canoe Rental shack by the creek was not a business so much as a suggestion. A crooked sign, 3 boats tied to a tree, and a man named Gary who might have been there since 1948. Dad would slap a 20 into Gary's hand and say, "We'll be back in a couple hours," like it was no big deal. No forms, no helmets, no waiver. Just a paddle, a life vest that definitely had not been certified since Eisenhower, and you, wobbling into a canoe while Dad shoved you off the bank with one foot. Once you got going, though, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you realize just how loud life usually is. Birds overhead, water slapping against the side, and Dad telling the same story about how he once saw a snapping turtle the size of a garbage can. You never saw one, but you wanted to. You learned how to steer, sort of, and how to duck when you went under a low branch too late. You got soaked, you laughed, and when you finally dragged the canoe back onto dry land, Dad would clap you on the shoulder like you had just completed Navy SEAL training. But if that creek showed you the earth, the next place aimed a little higher, right up into the stars. Polyester leisure suits were loud, shiny, and unapologetically bold. They were not just clothing, they were a state of mind. Wearing one meant you were not afraid to stand out, to sweat a little, to dance a lot. These suits shimmered under disco lights, turned heads at the roller rink, and clung to your every move. They were not comfortable, they were not breathable, but they were unforgettable. The cut was wide, the collars were wider, and the colors ranged from banana cream to burnt orange. Every department store carried them. Every television dad had one. Every uncle wore one to a wedding. They were like armor for extroverts, flashy, fearless, and fun. You were not blending in, you were making an entrance before you even opened your mouth. They were the uniform of a generation trying to find cool in chaos, and for a brief window, they were it. Today, they are costume shop punchlines, but they once made people feel slick, sharp, and modern. They were part rebellion, part performance, part polyester fantasy. Why did we ever let go of a style that dared us to be this loud on purpose? Playgrounds used to be a little more dangerous, and the metal slide on asphalt was the crown jewel of poor design. In the 1970s, nearly every school or park had one. It stood tall, often 2 stories high, baking in the sun until it could sear the back of your legs. No shade, no padding, just you, gravity, and a prayer. The steps up were made of thin metal bars. The top had no real guardrails, and when you slid down, you hit that blacktop like a dropped steak. But we lined up for it anyway, over and over. There was something thrilling about the danger. It was a rite of passage, a fast, hot, jolting ride that ended in a dusty scrape or bruised elbow. Teachers watched from afar. Parents shrugged. Kids were expected to bounce back. If you made it to the bottom without a scream, you earned bragging rights. If you got burned, you wore it like a badge. Safety standards have come a long way since then, but so much of that fearless, feral childhood play was tied to moments like these. Today, it is hard to believe we once thought that was normal, but deep down, part of us misses it. There was a time when SNH green stamps were as good as cash. You collected them with every grocery run, every gas station stop, every purchase that counted. And then you filled the little books. Carefully, patiently, with the pride of someone building something out of nothing. Families traded them in for toasters, radios, even bicycles. It felt like free rewards for loyalty. A quiet handshake between shopper and store. The moment you tore out a full book and handed it over felt like winning something without spending a dime. For many working-class families, it was the only kind of bonus life ever handed out. But loyalty changed. By the late 1970s, inflation had twisted prices beyond recognition, and stamps felt like yesterday's trick. Credit cards came in, bringing points and cashback offers. Big box stores offered everyday low prices instead of incentives. And suddenly, people did not want to save pages of stamps anymore. They wanted savings now. S&H tried to pivot, offering catalogs, electronics, even vacations. But it was too late. The books sat half-filled in kitchen drawers, forgotten. The redemption centers closed. The stamp became a relic. And with it, the ritual faded. Ask someone who grew up with S&H, and they will smile at the memory. But they will also tell you when it ended, it felt like losing part of what made everyday shopping feel like a game worth playing. The Firehouse Pancake Breakfast was not just a fundraiser. It was a local holiday. Dad would wake you up early on a Sunday, say, "Put on your shoes." And before you could ask questions, you were in line behind a dozen people all craving the same thing, a plate piled high with pancakes. The folding chairs wobbled, the long tables had little dents and permanent syrup rings, and everything smelled like melted butter and maple sugar. Real maple syrup was a luxury, so they used the bottled kind, the kind that came out slow and stuck the lid shut like glue. Firefighters in aprons manned the griddles, flipping pancakes like they had trained for it. Dad would nod in approval, pile his plate, and crack a joke to someone in line about how this was the real breakfast of champions. Dad never won, but he always bought 5 tickets just in case. It was not about the pancakes, really. It was about community, about showing up. And when breakfast was over, he would say, "Let's make a stop on the way back." That stop? Usually a roadside museum with one very questionable claim to fame. Stretch Armstrong looked like a superhero and felt like a bag of rubber cement. And that is why we loved him. This was not a stiff plastic action figure with a gimmick. This was a toy you could actually wrestle, stretch his arms across the room, twist his legs into knots, tie him in a bow, and he would always bounce back. No matter what you did, he never broke. Well, unless you were one of the unlucky few who found out what was really inside, a mysterious goo that made a mess you would never forget. But that was the risk, the thrill. It felt like you had your own indestructible sidekick, part science experiment, part best friend. You were not just playing with a toy, you were testing the limits of physics in your bedroom. Stretch Armstrong was more than a toy. He was a test. Could you push him further than your friends? Could you stretch him longer than the last time? For many kids, he was the one toy that felt indestructible, like a friend who could take any hit and never complain. He lived in closets, under beds, wrapped around lampposts and table legs. Now, he lives in memories and retro collectors' shelves. Why do we remember a rubber man with such strange affection long after the elastic gave out? Shrinky Dinks were magic in plastic form. You started with a sheet, clear, flexible, and begging to be colored. You grabbed your markers, drew a wild design, cut it out with safety scissors, and popped it in the oven. What came out was a tiny, hardened version of your masterpiece, often warped but always perfect. Watching it shrink behind the oven door was part of the thrill. You would kneel on the floor, peering through the glass, and gasp as your drawing curled, twisted, and finally flattened. Kids made keychains, jewelry, ornaments. Whatever their imagination allowed, it felt like crafting with sorcery. One minute you were tracing cartoons or making friendship tags. The next you held a miniaturized relic in your palm. The smell of melting plastic filled the kitchen. Parents worried, but no one stopped us. Shrinky Dinks were affordable, creative, and wildly popular at every sleepover and birthday party. You could even buy branded kits, superheroes, cartoon characters, holiday themes. But the best ones were always your originals. There was something deeply satisfying about seeing your art transformed like that. Tiny, tough, and totally unique. We never questioned the process. We just knew it felt like creating something real, something small that still felt huge. Oldsmobile was the brand your grandfather trusted. It was dependable, steady, and proudly American. In the 1970s, it was one of General Motors' most successful lines. The Cutlass was everywhere. Parking lots, driveways, high school graduation gifts. It was a badge of middle-class confidence. But times changed. Japanese automakers brought new efficiency. The luxury market moved to BMW and Mercedes-Benz. And Oldsmobile struggled to define itself. Was it sporty? Was it classic? Was it for young drivers or retirees? The answers never came. Designs grew stale. Performance lagged. The name Oldsmobile started to feel like a joke no one wanted to explain. By the time they rebranded, no one was listening. And the name started to sound old. By the 1990s, Oldsmobile felt like a brand out of time. Sales dropped. Dealers lost faith. General Motors tried to rebrand it, update it, give it a new face. But it was too late. The final Oldsmobile rolled off the line in 2004. For decades, it was the quiet heart of the American road. And then it was gone. Not with a crash, but with a sigh. A slow fade into silence. And if you ever drove one, you remember. The smell of the vinyl seats, the hum of the engine on a long drive. Oldsmobile did not just fail, it retired. The used bookstore with the ham radios in the back was the kind of place where time folded in on itself. You walked in and the smell hit you first. Paper, dust, and something that might have been pipe smoke from 50 years ago. Dad would head for the nonfiction section like it was a treasure map, and you would start flipping through comics that had long-forgotten characters in them. Every wall was covered in books, stacked too deep, sometimes sideways, sometimes just crammed in with no regard for order. But the real secret was in the back room. That was where the ham radios lived. Static buzzed from old speakers, and every now and then a voice would crackle through saying something like, "Calling from Connecticut. Do you copy?" Dad would nod slowly, say, "Nice rig," and start talking shop with the owner like they were part of some invisible club. You never understood a word of it, but it felt cool anyway, like your dad knew something no one else did. He would pick up a radio, fiddle with a dial, and say, "This one's got personality." The man behind the counter always nodded like that meant something. But if you thought that place had character, wait until you see Dad at the county auction barn, outbidding strangers for a box of who knows what. Shag carpeting was not just floor covering, it was a lifestyle choice. You did not walk across it, you sank into it. It came in colors no one had ever seen in nature. Burnt orange, mustard yellow, electric blue, and it stretched wall to wall, daring you to find the floor beneath. Every house in the 1970s seemed to have it, and every child seemed to lose at least one toy inside it. It muffled footsteps. It held warmth. It made every room feel like a sunken lounge. Lying down on shag was like being hugged by the room itself. It made even silence feel plush. But shag had a downside. It trapped dust. It collected everything. It was impossible to clean. And yet, for all that, it felt luxurious, decadent, soft under bare feet during cartoons and cereal mornings. It was carpeting with an opinion. Now we look back and laugh at it. But once, it was a dream realized in fabric form. Why did we trade comfort that bold for floors that whisper and forget? Tang was not just a drink, it was a symbol of the future. Pitched as the beverage astronauts drank in space, this orange-powdered miracle made you feel like you were participating in the space race from your own kitchen. Every kid wanted Tang. Every mom kept a jar in the cupboard. All you needed was water and a spoon, and suddenly you were sipping the same stuff that orbited the Earth. It was sweet, artificial, and packed with flavor. And it made you feel cool. The powder never fully dissolved, which meant gritty sips near the end were just part of the experience. If you got the scoop size right, you earned that perfect bright orange glow. Too much, and it was syrupy sludge. Too little, and it was just sad orange water. Tang was more than a drink, it was a cultural event. The jar was wide and squat with a screw-on lid, and every household seemed to have one. Kids felt proud making it on their own. No adult needed. It became the go-to for lunch, after school, and Saturday cartoons. You never questioned the science behind it. You just knew that if it was good enough for NASA, it was good enough for you. That dusty scoop brought the cosmos into your kitchen. High Karate aftershave was a joke and a phenomenon all at once. It came in a cheap bottle with a commercial that turned masculinity into a parody of itself. Spray this on, and women would attack you. Literally. The ads were absurd, over the top, and completely unforgettable. But behind the humor was a surprisingly decent scent. High Karate became the go-to for teenage boys trying to smell grown-up and grown men trying to stay playful. It was the cologne you found in your dad's drawer next to the tie clips and old movie stubs. But the joke wore thin. Trends shifted. The 1980s wanted power and polish, not camp and chaos. High Karate was quietly discontinued. Stores stopped stocking it. The bottles became rare. Today, it is a punchline for some and a scent memory for others. A whiff of what it meant to be young, to be bold, to believe that a fragrance could change everything. The flea market at the county fairgrounds was not just an event. It was an ecosystem. Hot pavement under your feet, the smell of popcorn mixing with motor oil, and a wall of voices haggling like they were at a medieval bazaar. Dad had a game plan. He always did. First, a lap to scout. Then back around to make the real choices. You wandered behind him wide-eyed, marveling at tables full of license plates, rusted tools, vintage comic books, and a surprising amount of questionable homemade jerky. One guy sold nothing but bumper stickers with sayings that would get you sent to the principal's office. Another had rows of toy yo-yos. And even though Dad warned you, you begged for one anyway. It broke in 5 minutes, maybe 6, but you still carried it around like it was gold. There was always a booth with used records blaring classic rock through dusty speakers, and Dad would flip through the crates like he was searching for buried treasure. Every once in a while, he would hold one up and say, "Now this is music." You did not argue. Not when he looked that happy. And if you thought flea markets were a lawless land of loose change and sunburns, just wait until you hear about the go-kart track that somehow never got shut down. Olympia beer was not flashy. It was not exotic. It was the working man's brew. Born in Washington State and famous for its "It is the water" slogan, Olympia carved out a loyal base across the Pacific Northwest. It tasted like fishing trips, union picnics, and back porch summers. You did not drink it to impress anyone. You drank it because it was yours. But the beer wars were brutal. Big national brands like Budweiser and Miller came swinging with huge ad budgets and coast-to-coast reach. Olympia tried to expand, but its regional charm did not scale well. The further it traveled from the rivers and forests of its home, the more it lost its soul. What made it special could not be bottled and shipped across state lines. It was bought out, reformulated, stripped of its identity. By the 1980s, the writing was on the wall. The original brewery closed, the taste changed, and loyal drinkers quietly moved on. Today, Olympia still exists in name, brewed by a different company in a different place. But those who remember the real thing will tell you, it is not the same. And maybe it never could be. It was not advertised. It was not even on a main road. Just a crooked wooden sign and a driveway that dipped behind an overgrown hedge. But if Dad tapped the wheel twice and said, "Here we are," you knew it was magic. The model train store in the back of someone's garage was no bigger than a single-car stall, but inside, it felt like a kingdom. Shelves were packed to the rafters with tiny train cars, tracks, tunnels, even tiny trees with even tinier squirrels. The air smelled like dust and old metal, the kind of smell that never leaves your coat. You would lean in to watch the train circle a miniature mountain range while Dad made small talk with the gray-haired man in suspenders, who clearly ran the whole operation on nothing but love and nostalgia. "This one's from 1952, the man would say, handing Dad a coal car like it was a rare coin. You did not know what made it special. You just knew Dad's eyes lit up in that way he saved for fishing trips and baseball games. It was not just a store. It was a secret clubhouse for grown men who still believed in toy engines and pretend towns. And if you think that was charming, wait until you smell what comes next. Free popcorn at the furniture store. Pet rocks were the most absurd, brilliant, and completely sincere product of the 1970s. Imagine walking into a store and buying a rock. Not a toy that looked like a rock, an actual rock. And not just that, your new pet came in a box with straw bedding and a care manual. In a world spiraling through inflation, war, and cultural tension, Americans collectively decided to laugh. And they laughed by adopting a rock. The genius was not the object, but the moment. It was a wink to consumerism, a joke played perfectly straight. And yet, for some children, it became real. It was the kind of gag that somehow turned genuine, because it gave kids something stable in a world that felt anything but. For some families, it was the only pet they could afford. They named their rocks. They brought them to school. They carried them in pockets like loyal companions. Pet rocks sold by the millions. For a few dollars, you bought not just the item, but the idea that maybe life did not need to be so serious. Maybe in a world of chaos, you could still find control in something that literally never moved. They vanished as quickly as they arrived, leaving behind nothing but confused memories and collectors with original boxes. Why did something so silly feel like the most comforting purchase of the decade? There was a moment in time when Betamax by Sony felt like the future. It had better video quality, a sleeker build, and came from a company America respected. But the future is not always decided by quality. It is decided by marketing, accessibility, and sometimes dumb luck. As families across the United States tried to tape late-night movies and birthday parties, VHS was waiting in the wings with longer record times and cheaper manufacturing. Sony clung to Betamax like it was a crown jewel, refusing to open the format to other producers. Meanwhile, JVC made sure VHS was everywhere. Department stores, rental shops, even those weird catalogs your uncle subscribed to. Betamax became the expensive outsider, and slowly, painfully, it vanished. What makes it worse is how many people swore it was better. You hear it even now, that Betamax was sharper, that it deserved to win, but it did not, and the shelves emptied and the VCRs were unplugged. We talk a lot about technology moving too fast, but this was a case of the better tech losing the race. People did not just throw out a tape, they threw out a bet on something they believed in. That loss still stings for those who remember. They were not just for carrying sandwiches and juice boxes. They were badges of honor. In the 1970s, metal lunchboxes with cartoon characters were everything to a kid. You marched into school like you owned the place if you had the Brady Bunch, Scooby-Doo, or Fat Albert slung over your arm. They clanged when you walked, chipped when you dropped them, and smelled like peanut butter forever. But they were yours. The thermos inside matched the design, with a plastic cup that screwed on top and often leaked just enough milk to give the lunchbox that signature sour scent. You would line them up on the windowsill during class or hide secret notes inside the lid. The paint would eventually chip, the latches would rust, but you never wanted to give it up. Today, they have been replaced by soft-sided, logo-free lunch carriers. But for those who grew up in that era, seeing one again brings back the sound of the bell, the taste of a bologna sandwich, and that magical feeling of opening your box and hoping you got a Hostess cupcake instead of raisins. They were loud, proud, and deeply personal. One glance at the dented metal, and the memories rush back like a school bell in September. CB radios were more than trucker toys. They were a direct line into an unseen world. In the 1970s, everyone wanted one. From long-haul drivers to suburban teens, the airwaves buzzed with chatter, codes, and nicknames. It was the internet before the internet, except it smelled like motor oil and lived in glove compartments. Citizens band radios turned anyone into a voice on the road, a personality on the move. You had a handle, not a name. You learned to say Breaker 19 and ask for a 1020. It was cryptic, cool, and weirdly intimate. There was magic in being anonymous, but still known. On those scratchy frequencies, your words mattered more than your face. For kids, it felt like being part of a secret club. For parents, it was safety and social life combined. The CB craze went nationwide, fueled by trucker movies, novelty songs, and a hunger for connection. People shared recipes, gave weather reports, even fell in love. And then, as suddenly as it came, it faded. Static returned, antennas came down. But ask anyone who ever had one, and they remember. The hum, the jargon, the thrill of being heard by a stranger miles away. Why did we stop talking when it was finally so easy to listen? Radio Shack. You did not go to Radio Shack to shop. You went there to touch. The moment you walked through the door, it was like stepping onto a spaceship. Racks of wires, batteries, and gadgets you had never even heard of. And in the middle of it all, the demo table, a flashing, beeping paradise. Dad would say, "We're just browsing," but an hour later, he was still pressing buttons, turning knobs, and pretending he was building a satellite in the garage. You would find the mini keyboard and try to play "Mary Had a Little Lamb" while he talked tech with the teenage clerk behind the counter. Every once in a while, he would point at something and say, "I had one of these back in college," even if he definitely did not. He would pick up a transistor radio, weigh it in his hand like a jeweler inspecting a rare gem, and give a long, low whistle. Solid piece of work. He never bought anything over $20, but you always walked out feeling like you had been part of a NASA mission. If imagination had a store, it was that one. And right around the corner from that tech wonderland, a pet store where you begged and somehow always walked out with something in a plastic bag. The chatter telephone by Fisher-Price was more than a toy. It was a rite of passage. Long before smartphones and screen time, toddlers dragged this smiling, wide-eyed friend behind them like a badge of growing up. It clacked as it rolled, its rotary dial spinning with every giggle and grab. Children pretended to make calls, mimicking parents with absolute seriousness, pressing plastic receivers to their ears and speaking into the world. It was not electronic. It made no real calls, but it was powerful. Because it gave kids something adults had: control, conversation, importance. It was not just play, it was practice. With every pretend conversation, a child rehearsed how to be heard. Every child who played with it was rehearsing a future where they would matter. The clicking eyes, the ringing bell, the chunky plastic body, it was built to survive anything. And most did. Decades later, many are still found in attics, dusted with time but still smiling. For a generation, the chatter telephone was the first introduction to technology, play, and imagination, long before those things were ever separate. Why does one of our earliest toys still feel more human than the phones we carry today? Clark Equipment Company once helped build America. Its construction vehicles, forklifts, and loaders were staples on job sites across the country. From highways to factories, if something big was being built, Clark was likely there. The brand stood for toughness and reliability. But the 1970s brought headwinds. Inflation climbed, industrial jobs declined, foreign competitors offered cheaper alternatives, and Clark, heavy with overhead and tradition, struggled to pivot. Its innovation slowed, its market share shrank. Machines once seen as symbols of progress started to look like dinosaurs, You could still find them in use, but fewer every year. Workers were laid off. Plants closed. By the 1980s, it was a name people remembered, not one they relied on. Pieces of the company were sold, reorganized, absorbed. What remained was a fragmented legacy. Ask a retired construction worker or a union foreman from the era, and they will nod. They will remember the green machines, the noise, the muscle. Clark Equipment Company did not just lose customers, it lost relevance. And in the business of building, that is the one thing you cannot rebuild. If this brought back a memory, share it below, tap like and subscribe so you do not miss the next ride down memory lane.